Before the world forgot its name, before its rivers ran dry and its maps turned blank, there was a morning of perfect peace. A morning so still that even time seemed to hold its breath. And when the sun rose over the empire of eternal peace, it was for the last time. The dawn began quietly, a slow unfurling of light across the marble towers and terraced gardens of a city that had never known war. Golden rooftops shimmered in the early mist. Doves circled above the palace domes, their wings catching the first rays of the sun. From the narrow alleys came the smell of warm bread and honeyed figs. Merchants stretched their arms, yawning beside their stalls. Children chased each other between fountains, their laughter rising like music. Everything was ordinary, everything was beautiful, and everything was ending. The river that wound through the heart of the city moved sluggishly, as if tired from centuries of peace. Fishermen cast their nets lazily into the water, not knowing that by nightfall, neither they nor their nets would ever be seen again. Across the empire, in towns and villages spread like stars across a map, life followed its gentle rhythm. Bells rang from temples, farmers tended their fields, artists painted under blooming olive trees. The empire's people believed themselves eternal, untouched by time, unshaken by conflict. For nearly 400 years, no war had scarred their soil. Their rulers spoke of balance, of harmony, of perfection. They believed peace was not simply a blessing, it was their destiny. And so, when the sun rose that morning, no one suspected that destiny had grown weary of them. In the eastern quarter of the capital, a potter named Lorian knelt beside his kiln, tracing the faint cracks in a vase he'd crafted the night before. He frowned, not because it was broken, but because it wasn't. It was flawless, too flawless. No imperfection, no mark of the hand, no trace of effort. He felt uneasy, staring at it, as if the vase were staring back. Nearby, his wife hummed an old song, unaware that her voice would be among the last sounds the empire would ever hear. High above the waking city, sunlight slid across the palace balconies. The emperor stood alone in his garden, watching the river. He was old, but his face was calm, carved with the serenity of a man who believed the gods had favored him. The empire of eternal peace had no enemies. No soldiers patrolled its borders, for there was nothing to fear. No prisons, for no crime. No walls, for no danger. Yet beyond those silent borders, the world had begun to forget. Maps drawn by foreign hands had grown faded along the edges. The empire's name, Ilisara, was still written in gold ink, but each year it seemed to grow smaller, the letters softer, as if the parchment itself resisted remembering. As the sun climbed higher, light spilled into the great library, the largest in the known world. Scrolls filled with poems, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, the sum of human thought, slept quietly on their shelves. A young scribe named Miran paused her copying to rub her eyes. She thought she saw the ink shimmer, as if the letters were moving. When she blinked, they were gone. By midday, the air felt strange, still calm, still beautiful, but thick, heavy, like air before a storm that never comes. Birds flew low over the river, their cries muted. The shadows under the arches grew longer than they should have been. No one noticed. No one ever does before the end. That night, the empire would vanish, not in flame or flood, but in silence. No screams, no ruins, only the faint echo of a place that forgot how to die. And so began the final sunrise of the empire of eternal peace, a morning written in light and erased by nightfall. They called it Ilisara, the empire of eternal peace, a realm so tranquil that even the wind seemed to move more gently above its fields. From the shimmering coasts of the west to the quiet orchards in the east, there were no battlefields, no broken towers, no blood-stained banners. The empire had known harmony for so long that its people believed conflict itself had been tamed. like a wild animal that had learned to sleep beside them. Ilisara was a kingdom of balance. Every city was designed in perfect symmetry. Streets curved like the lines of a song. Rivers ran in deliberate paths carved by ancient engineers. And temples stood where sun and shadow met precisely at noon. The capital, Lyrith, was known as the city that breathed with the stars. At night, its domes reflect constellations so perfectly that travelers could navigate by the city's rooftops instead of the sky. The empire's artists painted not with passion, but with patience. Their works were flawless, yet strangely cold, as if emotion itself had filed away for the sake of beauty. Its sculptors carved faces so serene that they seemed to listen rather than speak. And its musicians, it was said, could play songs so soft that flowers turned toward the sound. But for all its harmony, something in Elisara felt hollow. Peace had lasted too long. Children grew up never hearing the sound of thunder because storms were said to be discords in nature, and the empire's weather workers, through rituals and devices, had learned to soften the skies. There were no prisons, no soldiers, no courts. Disagreement itself was considered a sickness, and those who could not live quietly simply left. No one knew where they went. No one ever asked. In the palace, the emperor, Callion the Serene, ruled not with fear, but with silence. He rarely spoke. When he did, his words were brief and absolute. His face, always calm, was carved into every coin and statue. He was loved, but in the way one loves a god, from a distance and without question. Beside him sat the Council of Harmony, 12 advisors chosen for their perfect record of obedience. They debated nothing. They agreed on everything. And so, the empire drifted through the centuries like a dream no one dared to wake from. There was a story told among the oldest families that once, long ago, Elisara had been born from war, that its founders had made a pact with the heavens. We shall trade our passions for peace, our chaos for eternity. And the gods, amused, agreed. Whether the tale was true or not, none could say. But sometimes at night, the oldest citizens would sit by their lamps and whisper. Perhaps the gods kept their side of the bargain, and now they've come to collect ours. Within the city, perfection became law. If a painter left a single brushstroke imperfect, their work was destroyed, not by punishment, but by pity. If a singer's voice trembled, the audience would weep, not for the song, but for the flaw. If a child was born with a mark or scar, it was hidden, gently, as if the empire feared imperfection more than death itself. The years turned like clockwork. Festivals came and went, marked by soft music, incense, and light drifting through glass towers. Every dawn was the same, every sunset identical. And though the people smiled, few remembered why. Even time seemed to move slower here. The sun hung longer in the sky, the seasons arrived with hesitation, and the stars over Lyrith shimmered in patterns that never changed. It was as if the empire had been placed inside a glass dome, preserved, untouched, perfect. But perfection, like glass, is fragile. One breath too deep, and it cracks. In the palace archives, deep below the marble halls, there lived a man who saw those cracks, not in the walls, but in the years themselves. He was the royal astronomer, a quiet, aging scholar named Sirin Valen. He spent his nights on the palace roof, charting the heavens with brass instruments polished to a mirror shine. He noticed something, subtle at first, a dimming of certain stars, a shift in constellations that had remained fixed for centuries. Time, it seemed, was bending ever so slightly around Elisara, like light around a flame. He began to write his findings in a book of thin, delicate paper. Each page bore the same final line, written in trembling ink. The sky forgets us. One night, Sirin requested an audience with the emperor. He was granted 5 minutes. Kneeling before the throne, the old astronomer spoke softly. "Your Majesty, the stars have begun to move. Their memory of us fades. If the heavens forget our name, the world will follow." The emperor listened with that same serene expression, then smiled gently. "Old man, you see too much of the sky and too little of the earth. Our peace is eternal. The stars are simply learning to be still." He dismissed Siren with a wave of his hand. And so the warning was lost, buried beneath the comfort of a lie. Outside, the empire continued to hum with quiet life. Children studied under the glow of crystal lamps. Poets wrote verses about the color of silence. And far away, the rivers began to flow slower, as if forgetting where they were meant to go. The peace of Elisera endured, unbroken, unchallenged, and unseen. Until the night when the walls began to whisper. Low music fades, a low hum grows, like the breath of something stirring under the earth. Low ambient hum, wind through empty corridors, distant chime of bells. The narrator speaks slowly, almost like remembering something half forgotten. By the time the whispers began, Elisera was already fading, though no one could see it yet. The empire still glittered in the sunlight, still sang its songs of peace. But beneath the marble floors of the palace, something had started to stir. It began as a murmur, faint as breath through stone. Servants heard it first, while cleaning the lower halls. A sound like water trickling, or parchment being torn very slowly. They told each other it was just the pipes, or the shifting of old foundations. But as the days passed, the sound began to form patterns, pauses, cadence, almost as if the walls themselves were whispering words. At night, when the corridors grew dark and the oil lamps flickered low, guards claimed to hear voices beyond the walls, soft, pleading voices speaking in forgotten tongues. One young guard, Elias, swore he heard his own name. He followed the sound, heart trembling, down into the lower passages near the emperor's hall. There, the whisper became clearer, almost human. "Do you remember the wind? Do you remember the world before silence?" it asked. Elias ran. The next morning, his armor was found neatly folded beside the gate. He was never seen again. Word of the whispers spread quietly. No one dared speak of them openly. Silence had become the empire's law. But fear has its own voice, and soon even the nobles began locking their doors at night. Some said it was the ghosts of those who had left the empire centuries ago. Others believed it was the gods calling back what they had once given. In the palace kitchens, an old cook whispered to her apprentice, "Every piece is a promise, boy, and every promise must one day be paid." Meanwhile, high above the trembling halls, the emperor still sat in calm meditation. He listened to reports of harvests, festivals, the endless perfection of his realm, and he smiled. The walls could crumble around him, and he would still believe in harmony. Only the astronomer, Siren Valen, continued to worry. Each night, he climbed to the palace roof, hoping to find the stars steady again. But the constellations had grown unfamiliar, twisted, dim, as if the heavens were turning their gaze elsewhere. When he looked down upon the sleeping city, he saw a strange shimmering in the air, faint distortions, like heat above desert sand. Buildings seemed to ripple, streets appeared to bend. The city was beginning to forget its shape. Then came the night of the echo. It began just before midnight. A low hum rose from beneath the earth, not loud, but deep, like the note of a distant horn. Windows trembled. Lamps flickered. And for a moment, every sound in the empire, footsteps, laughter, the whisper of the wind, stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy, as if the air itself was listening. From within the walls, the voices returned. Not whispers this time, but a soft chorus of murmurs. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They spoke in unison. Perfection has no memory. Then, nothing. The sound vanished. The night continued. But by morning, one of the palace towers was gone. Not ruined, gone. Where it had stood, there was only smooth ground and a faint ring of ash. The emperor called it an illusion. He ordered the mapmakers to redraw the palace without the missing tower, as if it had never existed. And the people obeyed. Yet, beneath the calm surface, unease grew. Mothers began finding their children sleepwalking toward the city gates. Merchants swore their coins had changed, the emperor's face on them smiling wider than before. And the poets stopped writing altogether. Their words, they said, wouldn't stay on the page. The ink simply slid off, leaving the parchment clean. The empire that once prided itself on silence began to fear it. Even the air felt alive, like something unseen was listening from the corners of every room. Sarenvallen, the astronomer, wrote one final note in his journal before vanishing. The stars no longer look down upon us. They look through us. We are becoming transparent to the sky. His telescope was found shattered on the palace roof, his chair empty. Soft musical fade, a deep, sustained note, like breath held in darkness. By then, the people of Alisara had begun to understand, too late, that peace, stretched too thin, becomes silence, and silence, left too long, begins to speak. Long before the whispers began, there had been a man who saw it coming. He wasn't a prophet, or a priest, or a madman, only a watcher of the sky. His name was Sarenvallen, the royal astronomer of Alisara. For 50 years, he had studied the heavens from his tower of glass and brass, where the air was thin and the stars seemed close enough to touch. He had watched them shift, imperceptibly at first, until the constellations no longer aligned with the empire's seasons. To the farmers, it meant nothing. To the scholars, it was a curiosity. But to Saren, it was a warning. He began to notice that the stars above Alisara moved slower than anywhere else. Time itself lagged here, like a reflection in rippling water. Days stretched longer, nights lingered, and even the moon seemed hesitant to leave the sky. He recorded everything, each pattern, each dimming, each tremor in the cosmic clock. The last line of every entry read the same: "We are being forgotten." One evening, as the sun melted into violet haze, Saren stood on the palace balcony with his apprentice, a young woman named Irel. She looked up at the fading sky and asked quietly, "How can stars forget us? They do not think." Saren smiled sadly. "They remember in light," he said, "and when that light begins to bend away from us, it means the world has turned its face." Irel frowned. "Do you think something is coming?" Saren hesitated. "No," he whispered. "I think something is leaving." The next day, he was summoned to speak before the emperor. It was rare. The court had not called upon him in over a decade. When Saren entered the Hall of Harmony, he felt the air tighten. The emperor sat high upon his marble throne, surrounded by the council. Behind him, sunlight streamed through 1,000 panes of colored glass, painting the floor in gold and rose. Saren bowed deeply, his robe dusted with ash from sleepless nights. "Your Majesty," he began softly, "forgive an old man's worry, but the heavens are changing. The constellations drift away from our sky. The stars forget our place." The emperor regarded him with serene amusement. "The heavens are infinite," he said gently. "Their patterns mean nothing to the affairs of men." "But they do," Saren said. His voice trembled, not from fear, but urgency. "The empire's peace, our stillness, it is unnatural. Time no longer moves through us, Majesty. It moves around us." A low murmur passed among the counselors. The emperor raised a hand, and silence fell. "You speak of disorder," he said, "and there is no disorder in Elisara." Saren bowed again. "That is the very problem, my lord. There is no disorder, and without it, there is no life." For a long moment, the emperor said nothing. Then he smiled, slow, gentle, and final. "Your stars are wrong, Saren Valen. Elisara does not end. It endures." That night, the astronomer climbed back to his tower. He looked upon the sky one last time and saw something he had never seen before. A dark void, a gap where no stars shone. It was absence, as if a piece of the sky itself had been erased. And from that hollow darkness came a soft, steady pulse, like the beat of a distant heart. Saren whispered to himself, "The silence has found its shape." He sent letters to every scholar he knew, across the mountains, across the seas, warning them that Elisara was unraveling. None ever reached their destination. The messengers never returned. Within weeks, the edges of the empire began to blur on every map. Ink faded, borders softened. It was as though the empire's name refused to stay written. One evening, his apprentice Irel found him standing at his telescope, tears glimmering in his eyes. "The stars," he said quietly, "no longer move around us. We have become still, a pause in the world's breath." He turned to her, his voice trembling. "Tell them, when I am gone, that I tried to warn him. Tell them we stood too still for too long. Even the sky grows weary of looking at what never changes." That was the last night anyone saw him alive. When dawn came, his tower stood empty. Only his telescope remained, aimed at a patch of blank sky, and his final note written in silver ink that seemed to shimmer faintly. "Time itself may soon forget us." The warning had been spoken, but no one listened. Peace still ruled, perfection still smiled, and the silence waited, patient as eternity. The final night in Elisara arrived without omen. No thunder, no fire, no storm, just the soft turning of twilight, and the city exhaling, unaware it would never wake again. The sky glowed with the pale lavender of midsummer. Children laughed near the riverbanks, tossing petals into the water. Old men played chess beneath the lanterns, their pieces glinting like pearls. Somewhere, a singer's voice drifted through the warm air, a lullaby about peace, a song every child in the empire knew by heart. No one knew it would be the last song ever sung. In the markets, merchants packed away their goods with lazy smiles. The scent of roasted figs and crushed mint floated through the air. The lamps burned low, and across the city, one by one, windows filled with soft golden light. Everything felt normal. Everything felt eternal. And yet, there was a weight in the air, a stillness too perfect, the kind of silence that exists just before a storm, or the final breath before sleep. On the balcony of the palace, the emperor stood watching the horizon. The stars had not yet appeared, but the faint pulse of that dark patch in the sky, the void, seemed to glow in his eyes. He told himself it was nothing, that peace was strong, that silence was safety, that Elisara was eternal. And yet, somewhere deep within, even he felt the world holding its breath. In the lower city, a potter named Lorian, the same man who once feared his perfect vase, sat outside his home beside his wife. They spoke softly about the harvest, about the smell of the sea, about nothing in particular. When the night grew deeper, he looked toward the horizon and whispered, "The stars look different tonight." His wife smiled faintly. "They always do. You just never notice." He didn't answer. He couldn't find the words for what he felt, a strange tug in his chest, as if something vast and visible was drawing the world inward. In the temple district, monks lit the last candles of the evening ritual. Their chants echoed faintly against the marble walls, but when they ended, the silence that followed was so deep that one could hear the candle flames flicker. A young acolyte, frightened by the stillness, asked his teacher, "Master, why does it sound like the air is waiting for something?" The old monk smiled sadly. "Because it is." And in the observatory tower, now cold, now empty, a single page fluttered from Saren's open journal. It caught the moonlight as it drifted out the window, and before it touched the ground, the words faded from its surface like breath on glass. Midnight came. The city slept. The wind grew softer. The moon climbed high and hung motionless, its reflection perfectly still in the river below. No dogs barked, no birds sang, even the water forgot to move. It was as if the world itself was pausing, listening, preparing to let go. And then, in that endless moment between heartbeat and breath, the faintest sound echoed through the empire. A bell. One single bell, ringing somewhere deep beneath the earth. Its tone was neither sad nor joyful. It was final. The people did not wake. They simply drifted. The city dimmed, the lights went out one by one, and the empire, the great, shining Elysera, breathed out and was no more. No screams, no fire, no war. Just a whisper carried on the wind, soft as a sigh. Peace eternal. Soft pause, then silence. Only the sound of night, wind, and emptiness. When morning came, there would be no morning, only mist and dust and the hollow sound of a world that had forgotten itself. The night before, nothing had passed, and the world did not notice it was gone. When dawn came, it did not bring warmth. It did not bring sound. It came softly, like a hand brushing dust from an empty page. The sun rose over the valley where Elysera had stood, but the city was gone. No smoke, no ruins, no shattered stone, just an endless field of silver mist where streets and towers had once gleamed. The river still flowed, or perhaps it only seemed to. Its surface was too smooth, like glass poured across the earth. A few birds circled in confusion, calling out to a city that no longer answered. Their cries vanished into the air, swallowed by a silence too complete to echo. In the villages beyond the empire's borders, farmers woke and went about their day as always. They looked toward the horizon, where the golden spires of Elysera usually caught the morning light, and saw only emptiness. They thought it was fog, or rain, or the strange tricks of dawn. But as the hours passed, the mist did not move, and when they sent riders into it, the riders did not return. A merchant caravan approached from the south, the same route they had traveled for generations. When they reached the border, their horses stopped. The animals would not move forward, no matter how softly they were urged. The road ahead simply ended. Not broken, ended. The stone beneath their feet became dust, and the air shimmered with pale light. One traveler stepped forward and tossed a pebble into the haze. It vanished before it touched the ground. They turned back in silence. No one spoke during the journey home. Days passed, then weeks. Messengers came from distant kingdoms, carrying letters and questions. Where had the empire of eternal peace gone? Why had all trade and travel stopped? No one could answer. Some claimed the empire had been swallowed by a sandstorm. Others whispered that the earth had opened and taken it whole. But the oldest storytellers shook their heads. They said the empire had always been too quiet, too perfect, too still. And when something becomes too still, the world forgets it is there. By the time the second dawn arrived, the maps had already begun to change. The ink that marked Elysera's borders faded overnight. Cartographers redrew their scrolls, And where once the empire's golden capital had stood, they wrote a single word: uncharted. Across the continent, libraries lost pages. Books about Elysira grew thin, some turning blank, others filled with new histories that had never existed before. Records shifted, names changed. It was as if the empire had never been real. And yet, sometimes, in the quiet of evening, a traveler on a lonely road would feel a strange wind at his back, warm, perfumed, and heavy with distant bells. He would turn, expecting to see the faint glow of a city in the distance. But there would be nothing, only the wind, only the silence. Those who dared to enter the mist never returned, except for one, a wandering monk, found days later at the edge of the desert. He was half mad, trembling, eyes wide with wonder. He spoke of streets that shimmered like mirrors, of statues without faces, of doorways that led nowhere. He said the city is still there, but not in the world we know. It is behind the dawn, he whispered. You cannot walk to it. You must be forgotten to find it. Then he fell silent, and never spoke again. Soft fade of music, wind and distant ringing, like glass vibrating. The vanishing dawn became legend, a morning that erased a civilization so completely that even memory hesitated to recall it. But some say, when the sun rises through fog and the light feels thicker than it should, you can almost see the outline of the lost city, like a dream beneath the surface of the world. In the weeks that followed, the nations surrounding the vanished empire gathered in disbelief. Kings sent scouts, scholars argued, priests prayed. No one could accept that an empire of millions could vanish like smoke in sunlight. The roads leading into Elysira were still there, but they ended abruptly, like threads burned at the edge of a tapestry. The first expedition rode at dawn, 200 soldiers, a dozen historians, and one priest. They entered the mist with torches in hand. The flames burned strangely pale, their light swallowed by the air itself. By nightfall, the torches went out. By morning, the riders were gone. Only their horses returned, eyes wide, foam at their mouths, trembling. They collapsed before they reached the border. Days later, a second expedition was sent, smaller, slower, wiser. They tied ropes around their waists, anchoring themselves to great wooden stakes at the boundary of the fog. For hours they called out, voices echoing faintly as they walked forward. Then, one by one, the ropes went slack. When the explorers pulled them back, they found only frayed ends, cut clean, as if time itself had bitten through the fibers. Panic spread. Tales of curses and divine punishment filled the taverns. Merchants refused to travel near the borders. Farmers abandoned their lands. And soon, the silence of the vanished empire began to spread like a shadow, creeping outward mile by mile, turning fields into deserts and rivers into dry veins of stone.
The earth itself seemed to forget that life had ever touched it. In the far west, the scholar Mira Velen kept a journal of the disappearances. Each morning, she drew maps from memory. Each night, she found new gaps, mountains that had once existed erased from her parchment. Her notes grew frantic. "The land unravels," she wrote. "I can no longer trust the world to stay." When she awoke one morning, the ink in her journal had turned to dust. Even her handwriting refused to remember. Across the sea, sailors reported strange lights beneath the waves, vast, glowing shapes like towers sinking slowly in silence. When divers went below, they found nothing but sand and the faint hum of unseen currents. One ship vanished completely, its sails found drifting weeks later in a place where no wind ever blew. The silence became a religion. Some built shrines at the empire's border, temples of stone where no prayers were spoken. They believed the empire had ascended, lifted beyond time to preserve its eternal peace. Others feared it, claiming the empire's perfection had angered the gods, that it had been swallowed so that the world could remain imperfect enough to live. A generation passed. The children of those who remembered Ilisara grew up with only stories, and even those began to fade. Maps no longer marked the empire's place. Traders forgot the old routes. Languages shifted, words changed. And one day, no one could quite recall what the empire's name had been. It became the Silent Land, a myth, a bedtime story told to warn children that even peace can vanish. Yet there were whispers. Travelers crossing the empty plains claimed that sometimes, in the distance, they could see towers rising in the dawn mist, glowing faintly gold, as if sunlight remembered what the earth did not. Some heard faint bells, others heard laughter. All said the same thing. It felt like someone was watching, but not from our world. And so the search continued, year after year, century after century, until searching itself became the only proof that Ilisara had ever existed. But the truth was colder than myth, because sometimes when you look too long into nothing, nothing looks back. Soft silence. The wind fades. A single bell tolls far, far away. The search had found nothing. But in that nothing, the story of Ilisara had already begun to change, from history into legend, and from legend into memory's dream. In the weeks that followed, the nations surrounding the vanished empire gathered in disbelief. Kings sent scouts, scholars argued, priests prayed. No one could accept that an empire of millions could vanish like smoke in sunlight. The roads leading into Ilisara were still there, but they ended abruptly, like threads burned at the edge of a tapestry. The first expedition rode at dawn. 200 soldiers, a dozen historians, and one priest. They entered the mist with torches in hand. The flames burned strangely pale, their light swallowed by the air itself. By nightfall, the torches went out. By morning, the riders were gone. Only their horses returned, eyes wide, foam at their mouths, trembling. They collapsed before they reached the border. Days later, a second expedition was sent, smaller, slower, wiser. They tied ropes around their waists, anchoring themselves to great wooden stakes at the boundary of the fog. For hours they called out, voices echoing faintly as they walked forward. Then, one by one, the ropes went slack. When the explorers pulled them back, they found only frayed ends, cut clean, as if time itself had bitten through the fibers. Panic spread. Tales of curses and divine punishment filled the taverns. Merchants refused to travel near the borders. Farmers abandoned their lands. And soon, the silence of the vanished empire began to spread like a shadow, creeping outward mile by mile, turning fields into deserts and rivers into dry veins of stone. The earth itself seemed to forget that life had ever touched it. In the far west, the scholar Mira Velen kept a journal of the disappearances. Each morning, she drew maps from memory. Each night, she found new gaps, mountains that had once existed erased from her parchment. Her notes grew frantic. "The land unravels," she wrote. "I can no longer trust the world to stay." When she awoke one morning, the ink in her journal had turned to dust. Even her handwriting refused to remember. Across the sea, sailors reported strange lights beneath the waves, vast, glowing shapes like towers sinking slowly in silence. When divers went below, they found nothing but sand and the faint hum of unseen currents. One ship vanished completely, its sails found drifting weeks later in a place where no wind ever blew. The silence became a religion. Some built shrines at the empire's border, temples of stone where no prayers were spoken. They believed the empire had ascended, lifted beyond time to preserve its eternal peace. Others feared it, claiming the empire's perfection had angered the gods, that it had been swallowed so that the world could remain imperfect enough to live. A generation passed. The children of those who remembered Ilisara grew up with only stories, and even those began to fade. Maps no longer marked the empire's place. Traders forgot the old routes, languages shifted, words changed. And one day, no one could quite recall what the empire's name had been. It became the Silent Land, a myth, a bedtime story told to warn children that even peace can vanish. Yet, there were whispers. Travelers crossing the empty plains claimed that sometimes, in the distance, they could see towers rising in the dawn mist, glowing faintly gold, as if sunlight remembered what the earth did not. Some heard faint bells, others heard laughter. All said the same thing. It felt like someone was watching, but not from our world. And so the search continued, year after year, century after century,
until searching itself became the only proof that Elisara had ever existed. But the truth was colder than myth. Because sometimes, when you look too long into nothing, nothing looks back. The search had found nothing. But in that nothing, the story of Elisara had already begun to change, from history into legend, and from legend into memory's dream. It began with the cartographers, men and women who had devoted their lives to tracing the world's shape, woke one morning to find their maps had changed. Borders had shifted, rivers no longer flowed where they once did, and where the empire of eternal peace had once been, there was nothing. Not a blank space, not even empty parchment, just smooth paper, as if no ink had ever touched it. When they tried to redraw it, their hands trembled. The lines would not stay. The ink refused to dry. By nightfall, the new maps erased themselves too, not burned, not torn, just forgotten by the world. In the grand archives of Aramor, the librarian awoke to find hundreds of scrolls turned white. The shelves still stood full, but the words were gone. He held one in shaking hands, a history of Elisara written by the empire's own scholars. As he turned the pages, each letter faded like mist in the sun. By the final page, only a single phrase remained. All that is perfect must sleep. In universities and temples, debate turned to disbelief. How can an empire vanish from maps, from memory, from truth? One philosopher demanded. Another replied, perhaps it was never real. The argument spread like wildfire, and within a decade, young scholars laughed at the idea that Elisara had ever existed. The older ones stayed silent. Some because they doubted their own minds, others because they still heard faint bells in their dreams. Even the stars began to change. The royal astronomers' old charts, preserved in distant libraries, no longer matched the heavens above. Constellations shifted. Patterns that once guided travelers now pointed toward nothing. It was as if the sky itself had chosen to forget. And yet, there were cracks in the forgetting. An old sailor remembered docking at Elisara's shining port, the marble towers reflected in the sea like fire. But when he told his story, his grandchildren shook their heads. There is no such place, they said kindly. You must have dreamed it. The sailor tried to protest, but as he spoke, he could no longer recall the shape of the harbor or the name of the ship he had sailed. By nightfall, he wasn't sure if he had ever been there at all. In remote monasteries, monks began to notice missing verses in their holy texts. Lines once written in gold leaf now stopped mid-sentence, as though the world had grown tired of remembering. A single monk in the northern wastes recorded his fear in a trembling hand. If the map forgets the land, and the tongue forgets its name, will the soul forget itself? He sealed the letter in wax and buried it beneath the frozen earth. It remains the only known record that still speaks the name Elisara.
Decades passed. Children grew up learning new histories. New nations rose, claiming the lands where the empire once thrived. They built cities of stone, but every time they dug foundations, they found nothing beneath. No ruins, no bones, not even dust. The ground remembered nothing. By the end of the century, Elysira had become a myth told by wandering minstrels. A story of a city too perfect for the world, so perfect that the world let it go. People laughed at it, but sometimes, after the laughter faded, a strange silence would linger, and they would glance toward the east, where the morning mist hung just a little too long. The map had forgotten the empire, but dreams had not. Because some things the world can erase, but not the heart. And somewhere, in the secret places of sleep, the streets of Elysira still waited. He lived alone in the ruins of an unnamed village, a place so old that even the stones had forgotten their builders. They called him the Last Chronicler. No one knew his real name. Some said he was a scholar from the southern provinces. Others whispered that he was born in the vanished empire itself. He never confirmed either. He only wrote. His cottage was filled with parchment, walls covered with half-finished maps, drawings of towers no one else remembered, names scratched out and rewritten again and again so that they wouldn't slip away. By day, he walked the empty plains, searching for traces, a fragment of marble, a brick, a whisper. By night, he wrote until his fingers bled. He knew the world thought him mad. He didn't care. If no one remembers, he said softly, then it truly dies. His neighbors avoided him. Children threw stones at his door. But sometimes travelers came, curious, desperate, or simply lost. He would invite them in, offer tea brewed over a candle flame, and tell them stories. Stories of a golden city, where the air smelled of honey and marble dust, where no one raised a sword, where the silence of perfection was mistaken for peace. Some wept, some laughed, but all left changed. Because deep inside, something in his words felt true. One night, during a storm, a young woman knocked on his door. She carried a half-burned journal, a relic she'd found in an abandoned monastery. It contained only one phrase, repeated over and over in fading ink. "We will be remembered by silence." The chronicler wept when he saw it. He knew that handwriting. It was his mother's. That night, he stayed awake until dawn, writing feverishly, trying to recall every detail of his childhood.
The streets, the scent of fruit sellers in summer, the music at the Festival of Mirrors, the laughter of the river children. But with every word he wrote, another slipped away. His mind was being rewritten, not by time, but by the same forgetting that had taken the empire. He tried to fight it. He wrote faster. He scratched the words deeper. He whispered them aloud to himself, as if speaking them could hold them in place. "Elysra," he whispered. "Elysra, Elysra, Elysra," until his voice cracked and his ink ran dry. When the villagers entered his cottage days later, they found his chair empty. The candle still burned, but the man was gone. On his desk lay a single parchment, the final page of his life's work. It read, "I was there. I remember the dawn. I remember the silence. And if you can read this, then perhaps the world remembers too." The villagers buried the parchment beneath a willow tree, believing it cursed. But centuries later, when the winds shifted the soil, a traveler found it again. The letters had not faded, not a single one. They glowed faintly in the moonlight, like embers that refused to die. Soft music fades into a single note, a heartbeat, then quiet.
And so, though the chronicler vanished, his words did not. They drifted through the world like seeds on the wind, whispering to dreamers and poets, to those who stayed awake at night and felt the weight of a world that forgets too easily. And whenever a storyteller begins with, "Once there was an empire that vanished overnight," the chronicler lives again, in voice, in breath, in memory. Legends say the empire was devoured by its own perfection. Its marble streets gleamed too purely, its music too divine, its peace too absolute. And in the end, silence, vast and endless, consumed it. Some whispered that the gods took pity on the empire, lifting it away from the noise of the world, preserving its beauty in eternal stillness. No war, no pain, no sound. Just quiet, forever. Centuries later, travelers crossing the desert spoke of strange things. At dusk, when the wind changed, they heard faint bells ringing over the dunes, and laughter, distant and bright, carried on the sand. Some swore they saw figures shimmering in the heat haze, moving through cities that no longer existed, as if time had folded in on itself, and the empire still lived, just out of reach. Then came the archaeologists. Under shifting dunes, they found impossible ruins, walls that hummed like they were alive, statues without faces, and stones engraved with words that faded when touched. Machines malfunctioned near the site. Voices were caught on audio recordings, faint, melodic, and speaking no known tongue. One scientist wrote in his final report, "It's not that the empire was buried, it's that it's still here, and we are the ghosts walking through it." The myth evolved. People began to say the empire never truly disappeared, it simply moved into the realm of dreams. Those who dream deeply might walk its golden streets, hear the music of its fountains, and meet people whose faces they cannot remember upon waking. Every generation, someone wakes in tears, not knowing why their heart aches for a place they've never been. In modern America, stories began to resurface. Soldiers in the desert, explorers lost in endless dunes, and even ordinary people, all describing the same dream, a city of light and silence, and a bell that rings without sound. Psychologists called it collective memory. Historians called it coincidence. But there are some who believe time doesn't move forward, it loops, softly. And sometimes memory becomes a doorway. And so the story ends, not with destruction, but with erasure so gentle it feels like mercy. Because some things aren't meant to die. They're meant to fade, to drift into that quiet space between waking and dream, where memory becomes legend, and legend becomes the whisper of wind over ancient sand. So if tonight in the stillness of your sleep you hear faint bells in the distance, don't be afraid. Perhaps you've wandered into the empire that vanished overnight.